Well, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters in our common humanity, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for having me. I want to say particular thanks to the King's Life Society for hosting us, particularly to Emily and Fran. I'd really like to say thanks to Luke for having set up these series of debates which are important and fascinating. And it's always a pleasure to debate with Anne on any given subject, particularly on these issues. So thanks, guys, very much. Now, this evening we're considering the question, what is the moral status of the unborn child? This is the very question which the law has completely fudged or really ignored for the last 50 years or so. So it's at the very core of a series of bioethical questions, including abortion, including embryo-destructive research, and other such questions. I think there are two terms that we need to define in that question, obviously. One is moral status, the other is unborn child. I actually think defining terms is very important. I'll just illustrate that with a quick example, which if you've heard me talk before, I'm sorry for repeating myself. I was in Madrid a few years ago. I really like cider, really big fan of cider. And so I was going around saying, ¿Tiene sidra? Have you any cider? Unfortunately, it didn't sound like we're saying that. It sounded like we're saying ¿Tiene sidra? Like the French do, which did actually sound like ¿Tiene sida? Which of course means do you have AIDS? Not what you want to say to someone when you're trying to get a drink. But the importance of words is very clear, and it's especially clear in this debate. So, I'm going to define a few terms here. Moral status is relatively simple. Going from the Stanford Encyclopedia's definition, it really means the extent to which a thing's interests morally matter for its own sake, such that it can be morally wronged or indeed morally righted. You can act in a way that is morally wrong or morally right towards it. But in order to discern the moral status of anything, we have to discern what exactly that thing is. For example, we don't give moral status to pencils. However, if someone owns a pencil, we might think about the way that we treat the pencil by virtue of the fact that they own it. In other words, we care about the moral status of the owner as opposed to the thing owned, the inanimate object which is not owned. So what then is the object of our inquiry this evening? Well, it's the unborn child. And this needs to be rather unpacked a bit. What do we mean by unborn child? It's a fairly commonplace term, I think, but it's extraordinarily controversial for a lot of people. Well, the Oxford English Dictionary defines a child as a young human being below the age of puberty or below the legal age of majority. Unborn is a baby not yet born, so you could say that the unborn child is the youngest form of human being who is yet to be born. The fetus, which again, OED defines as unborn human more than 8 weeks after conception, and also the embryo, an unborn human, especially in the first 8 weeks from conception after implantation, but before all the organs are developed. And that should include the zygote, the very earliest form of human being, in other words, just recently conceived, the morula and the blastule as well, if you're being rather technical about it. The unborn child is a human being. This is again very controversial for a few people, so I'm going to substantiate it. A human being is a man, woman, or child of the species Homo sapiens, distinguished from other animals by superior mental development, power of articulate speech, and upright stance. That, as a species, is what makes us a human being. And the human being begins to exist from the point of conception. That's the only meaningful point that a human being can said to begin to exist. That's again defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, the action of conceiving a child or of one being conceived, which isn't particularly helpful, so I'm going to go a little bit more technical. Morden Persaud's The Developing Human defines conception as the procession of events that begins when a spermatozoon makes contact with a secondary oocyte or its investment. So in other words, when the sperm enters the egg, it goes forward to define when the genes of both are integrated, and says the zygote is characteristic of the last phase of fertilization and is identified by the first cleavage spindle. It's a unicellular embryo. That's their definition of the beginning of the developing human. Then we go on to Morden Persaud later on. They say the initial totipotent cell that is the result of fertilization, that is the zygote, marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. Going on to Arahili and Muller, defines the zygote. This cell results from the union of an oocyte, that is an egg, and a sperm. A zygote is the beginning of a new human being, i.e. an embryo. And finally, William J. Larson's Human Embryology, we begin our description of the developing human with the formation and differentiation of the male and female sex cells or gametes, which will unite at fertilization to initiate the embryonic development of a new individual. In other words, we get the point. Fertilization or conception is the beginning of a new individual human being, a new member of our species. In fact, this is agreed on by Peter Singer, who is radically pro-abortion. In fact, he goes further than that, as we will see later on. But he says, it is possible to give human being a precise meaning. We can use it as equivalent to member of the species Homo sapiens. Whether a being is a member of a given species is something that can be determined scientifically by an examination of the nature of the chromosomes in the cells. In this sense, he says, there is no doubt that from the first moments of its existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and eggs is a human being. Also, Baroness Warnock, only a fool would deny that human life begins at the point of conception, is her point of view in the Warnock Committee report. But the point of all of this is that an unborn child is not some other type of animal organism, like a dog or a cat or a plant. She is not part of an organism like a skin cell in your nose. She's not a quote-unquote potential human being. She's an actual living member of the species Homo sapiens in the earliest stage of her natural development. And like every other human being, unless she's severely damaged, let's say that then a terrible accident happens, God forbid, or let's say that she's attacked, or unless something else goes wrong within the pregnancy, she's denied or deprived of her necessary environment, she will, by her own internal and integral organic functioning, develop herself to all the more mature developmental stages of what is a human being, from the very beginning, from the zygote, right to birth itself. The embryonic, the fetal, the child, the adolescent stages are all phases in the development of a specific enduring entity, which we call the human being, who comes into existence as a single-celled organism, the zygote, and naturally develops, if all goes well, ceteris paribus, into who we are today. Whether it be a zygote or a morula or an embryo or a fetus or an infant or a prepubescent or a pubescent or an adolescent or an adult, all of these are simply stages of development. All of these signify the one creature that we call the human being. Why am I going on about human beings? What's so special about the phrase or the sense of being a human being? Well, human beings have a rational nature. We have a nature which possesses the inherent potentiality and thus gives rise to the capacities of reason and free will. That's what makes us, as creatures, as a species, particularly special. I mentioned earlier on that in order to discern the moral status of something, you have to know what it is. Well, this is absolutely key. And a rational nature is a personal nature, because these inherent natural capacities are personal. Right? Reason and free will enable the life of creatures that we describe as persons. Persons can engage in intellectual thought, to free actual choices, to relationships. These capacities belong to us by our nature, by virtue of being human creatures. So we human beings, by definition, are persons. By virtue of being persons, we have a unique value, and we refer to that as dignity. And rights that proceed from our possession of this unique personal nature, we call these natural rights. And I'm going to signify this whole approach to the human being as a form of dignitarian humanism, that is, a focus and an ethic on human dignity. So what we are is absolutely crucial. Now, this is something which is expressed, this dignitarian humanism, I would argue, in the human rights documents that we see. We see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly establishes the right to life to all human beings on this basis. Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable right of all members of the human family, all members of the human family, is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in the world. It refers to all human beings being free and equal in dignity and rights, and it establishes this without distinction of any kind. In other words, you may not discriminate. You may not say, this particular human being we will exclude from this particular set of laws or rules. I'll just mention also that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child gives legal protection before as well as after birth. So the unborn child here, as a human being, again applied to those rights, comes right down before birth as well as after. And the San Jose articles I'll just quickly mention are something you might want to look at just to confirm that this is really the state of human rights legislation. Now, the only way you can get past this, the only way you can get past the intrinsic dignity and rights of the human being based on her rational nature, based on the personal nature that she has by virtue of being a human being, is by a kind of moral dualism, which tries to separate out the concept of human being and human person, and thus creates a moral duality. Right? And it does this by constructing some idea of personhood which is based on the actualizing of whatever of those inherent potentialities that I mentioned earlier on. So reason, the capacity, the ability, not just the capacity to have reason, but the ability to exercise your reason. Or consciousness, the state of being conscious, or sentience as it's also known. Some people refer to a heartbeat. I've actually had someone try to define for me that you're a human being when you have a heartbeat, for whatever reason. It might be the brainstem, it might be some other thing. And it works much the same way that I just have for my definition of dignitarian humanism. It asks us, what makes us human? There's something which is more basic to being a person, to being a human, than just being a member of the human species, that you must have some extra thing that you exercise. So on the right track, therefore, they're on the right track in terms of noticing that this is the nature of a human being, but they take a drastic wrong turn because they make the actualizing of those capacities, of those potentialities, basic to what is a human being and what is therefore a person. All of these I'm going to suggest. It will depend on what we come out with in the debate. It depends on what people say. But all of these are what I would call adiaphoristic secondary qualities. That is, they are irrelevant secondary qualities that don't affect the substance. They're rather accidental and incidental to what makes you a person. So they ignore the substance, these people, the moral dualists, and they look at the accents. They look at the things that we do rather than what and who we are. The actualizing of inherent potentialities in a rational nature, which, as I just described, ought to be the root of our personhood. So if the actualizing of inherent potentialities is what makes you a person, well, who else can be excluded by this principle? I think this is a really important question, and this, I think, proves that there is an inconsistency consistently in the kind of people who try to say, well, yes, it must be, you have to have reason, you have to have consciousness, you have to have this, that, or the other, whatever qualities they're going to mention. Who else are you going to exclude by that? If you're going to say, for example, it's reason, are you going to therefore exclude from personhood the very severely mentally disabled? If you're going to say it's consciousness or sentience, are you going to exclude people who are in persistent vegetative states? What about people who are in comas? What about people who are in a dreamless sleep? And I often say the reason why I don't believe in killing unborn children is for the exact same reason that I don't believe in killing sleeping abortion lobbyists. It's exactly the same reason. I believe that everyone has equal nature and therefore equal rights, equal personhood. And you can't get a once and forever get out clause. You know, some people try to say, oh, but see, they had, if you're the sleeping person or you're in a coma or in a persistent vegetative state, which you once were a person. And because you once were a person, oh, that just continues on. Never actually explain why that is. I'm sorry, if you believe that there are such things as pre-personal human beings, then you also have to forward the idea, surely, if you're going to be consistent, that actualizing these potentialities is what makes you a person. That when you no longer can actualize, or you do not actualize those potentialities, that you are a post-personal human being. This is exactly the creed I would suggest to you of inequality and unjust discrimination that has plagued human history. Whenever you try to say, you know what, we're not equal as human beings, it's not the fact of our humanness, it's not our humanity that makes us equal, that gives us rights, that gives us equal rights, rather it's some other thing like our skin colour, or our sex, or our sexual orientation, or our class status, or whatever it is, that's going to be the determining thing. Well, how is that any different from going into the accidents and concentrating on the accidents within the arguments that moral dualists put forward? And just as an example of someone who engaged in this sort of thing, Peter Singer. Peter Singer genuinely doesn't believe the unborn child has any kind of rights, has any kind of moral status, and therefore he pushes the boat just that little bit further. If the fetus does not have the same claim to life as a person, he says, it appears that the newborn baby does not either. And the life of a newborn baby is of less value to it than the life of a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee is to the non-human animal. Why? Because he's not a humanist. He doesn't focus on the human being. He doesn't focus on our humanity. Rather, he focuses on other things as a determinant of a person, and therefore thinks that some human beings are less than or equal to animals that are not human, that do not have a rational nature, that do not have a personal nature. So I'm going to sum up my argument as the argument from humanity. This is going to be my argument this evening. Firstly, the unborn child is a human being, a biological human being. I think that is beyond controversy. Premise 2, human beings have a rational nature, and that rational nature is a personal nature. This is what gives us dignity, this is what gives us natural rights. Therefore, the unborn child has a rational personal nature, she is a person, and since all human beings share the same nature, we are all equally human, no one is more equal than another, or we all share the same humanity, all human beings, therefore, are equal. And therefore, the moral status and the rights of the unborn child is equal to that of every other human being. That's going to be my argument tonight. And I think that if we are going to have a proper debate, then we need to have, if this is not true, we need to have an alternative idea of the human person put forward to us that is better than that satisfies the conditions of saying, actually, this does not exclude anyone. because I think all forms of exclusion of the unborn child are going to exclude other human beings as well, that can actually affirm the equality that we do believe in by virtue of the human rights legislation that we've signed. We may not agree with that, but if you do, be honest enough to be honest in inegalitarians or anti-egalitarians in that sense. If you do not justify, if you do not believe in the humanity and the moral status of the unborn child, then you cannot believe in human equality and you cannot believe in principles of non-discrimination. That's going to be my contention tonight. And so I will now open it up to Anne, and I will open it up to the rest of you to see whether or not this really holds forward. But I think this, dignitarian humanism, is the only basis for the equality and the rights of every human being. Thank you.
Thank you.